and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Heather M. Joseph will present What Can Light Show Us About Brain Activity? Examining early neural and behavioral predictors of childhood ADHD. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the Foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has had such a great impact is we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded $475 million to fund more than 6,800 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Heather M. Joseph. Dr. Joseph is Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh and a 2021 BBRF Young Investigator grantee. Our webinar will begin with her presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel of your screen. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many questions as possible in the time allotted. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Joseph. Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited to share my work with you. So first, I'd like to start with that I have no conflicts of interest, and I do have research support, starting with the Brain Behavior Research Foundation. I also have support from NIMH, the Klingenstein Third Generation Foundation, and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And I'll share some of the work that was funded by each of these funders over the course of the presentation. So to get started, I will review the ADHD diagnostic criteria so that we are all aware of what ADHD means and what the criteria are as written in the DSM-5. So to start out, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, so it begins in childhood, and the individuals must have 6 or more symptoms. This could be 6 or more inattentive symptoms, or 6 or more hyperactive or impulsive symptoms, or a combination of 6 of each, inattentive, hyperactive, for a total of 12 for the combined presentation. Given that it is a neurodevelopmental disorder with childhood onset, the symptoms need to be present before age 12, and they need to be present in more than one setting. So this is not symptoms that are only appearing in one context, in one setting. This is pervasive across settings, across situations. Now, the severity of the symptoms might fluctuate given the circumstances or context within which the individual is in. And the symptoms are not better explained by something else. So for example, depression and anxiety, they both present with difficulty focusing, but that is not what's causing the symptoms for an individual with ADHD. And ADHD can be classified as mild, moderate, or severe, depending on the level of impairment due to the symptoms. So I'll also share that although attention and hyperactivity are in the name, ADHD really could be better understood as a disorder that is characterized by impairment in executive functioning skills. And these are skills that are necessary for execution of goals. These are things like impulse control, working memory, attention, problem solving, which includes planning and organization, and that could present in a variety of ways. So things like being easily excited, impatient, and frustrated, difficulty keeping track of time, difficulty tracking belongings, difficulty multitasking or failing to finish activities, and difficulty organizing tasks and activities. So these are all different ways that ADHD can present and different areas of executive functioning that are impaired for individuals with ADHD. ADHD is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder. It affects approximately 1 in 9 children in the US, and as many as 2/3 of these children with ADHD will continue to meet diagnostic criteria into adulthood. And importantly, even those who don't continue to meet the full symptom criteria are often found to have more challenges in adulthood than peers that did not have ADHD in childhood. So some of the impairments that are experienced for individuals with ADHD across the lifespan include difficulty with relationships, differences in health outcomes, challenges with self-esteem, different levels of success or challenges with occupational and educational attainment, and greater risky behaviors across the lifespan. So things like driving recklessly or more risky substance use. And the economic burden due to ADHD is estimated to reach $266 billion annually in the US. Although current treatments for ADHD, including medications and behavior therapy, are effective in reducing ADHD symptoms, even individuals that were treated for ADHD continue to experience greater challenges across the lifespan compared to their peers without ADHD. So what causes ADHD? Well, like most or all mental health conditions, there's really no one known cause. It's likely that ADHD is a result of combined effects of genetics and environmental factors that are different for any given individual. However, we do know that ADHD runs in families and is highly heritable. So why did I decide to study ADHD? Well, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, disruptive behaviors that are associated with ADHD are a common reason for presentation to the clinic and hospital setting, especially for very young children. So core symptoms of ADHD, like inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, can interfere with pre-academic skills even before a child enters school and can set them on a path that is more difficult. Yet ADHD is most often identified at school age after these impairments are already present. So early in my training, I became interested in really understanding the transmission of ADHD in families and the role of paternal or father parenting on child behavior. And I was, given the opportunity by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry to conduct a small 1-year pilot project where I studied fathers with and without ADHD and their young children ages 3 to 7. And the findings from this study suggested that children who are born to fathers with ADHD were nearly 3 times as likely to have the diagnosis, like meet full diagnostic criteria for ADHD, than children born to fathers without ADHD. And interestingly, several of the youngest children, so if you see here in the graph, the circle is around these 3 to 5-year-olds, they did not yet meet criteria. So they had, 4 or 5 symptoms of ADHD. And if you recall, you need to have 6 for a full diagnostic criteria. So they were probably what we would call sub-threshold and just shy of diagnostic criteria. So it's possible that these very young children, right before school entry or at the time of entry to school, don't yet meet diagnostic criteria, but are at very high risk of having ADHD later on. And if we could identify them and provide early interventions, it's possible that we could change their trajectory and support them in this critical period of transition to school age. So attention, behavioral, and emotional regulation are rapidly developing alongside brain development during the preschool years. Therefore, it can be challenging to know which children will grow out of these behaviors and which will persist. Less than 3% of children that are preschool age receive a diagnosis of ADHD. And these are most often the children that have very severe symptoms, and they're leading to things like safety concerns or even expulsion from daycare and preschool setting. For these children, this 3% with very severe symptoms at preschool age, most of them, about 90%, continue to meet diagnostic criteria later in childhood. However, most children with ADHD will be diagnosed later and could be missed for early intervention and not referred for treatment for several years. So some of the questions I had were, what do we know about brain development and function in individuals with ADHD? And are differences present even before a diagnosis of ADHD? If so, these early neural signals of risk for ADHD could potentially be used to identify children and families that could benefit from early interventions to reduce ADHD symptom severity and impairment. So to kind of summarize some of the research on brain and ADHD, what we know is that research studies using MRI or magnetic resonance imaging have examined some brain structures and identified reduced brain volume, which is most prominent in the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the parietal temporal regions for individuals with ADHD. And a couple of these regions I'll highlight because they're particularly important when we're thinking about ADHD symptoms. So the prefrontal cortex is important for higher order executive functions that we talked about as being impaired in ADHD, like planning, decision-making, working memory, and impulse control. And likewise, the parietal temporal region works in connection with the prefrontal cortex to sustain attention. And ADHD has been theorized in part to be due to delayed brain maturation. So in line with the classification of a neurodevelopmental disorder, research studies with children have supported this theory, showing that brain maturation, so things like cortical thickness and surface area, are delayed by approximately 3 years compared to children without ADHD. And again, these findings were most prominent in the cortical regions responsible for executive functioning and attention. Research over the years has extended beyond looking at the structures of the brain to begin to examine how the brain is working or functioning. So functional imaging examines brain activity, which region or regions of the brain are active during rest or during a specific task. So you might be wondering, how is brain activity measured? Well, blood flows to the brain to supply oxygen to neurons. And more oxygen being used in a certain area can tell us that neurons are more active in that region. So neuroimaging modalities that measure changes in oxygenation while the participant is resting or during a task can infer brain activity in various regions. So a new study published this year analyzed data from 124 research studies using fMRI, so functional MRI, to identify brain regions where activity is different for children and young adults with ADHD compared to those without ADHD. And that study did identify 16 regions with different types of activity when you compare the two groups. Brain regions that function differently in individuals with ADHD may serve as future areas of focus for targeted treatments to change brain activity or to strengthen connections between brain regions that could reduce ADHD symptoms or impairment. So what about preschool children? So I kind of started with the importance of looking very early and examining preschool kids that are at elevated risk before the disorder. But all of the studies that I've referenced so far on brain activity or structure have been conducted with school-aged children, the youngest of which is about 8 years of age, or adolescents and adults. So there actually are very few neuroimaging studies that have been done with preschool-aged children with ADHD. And this could be in part due to the fact that most children, as I've mentioned, are actually diagnosed later, so after the preschool age. Additionally, it's very challenging to obtain good quality MRI data from young children, and particularly young children with or at risk for ADHD. So the MRI machine is an enclosed space, it's loud, and the child must remain still, which for most 3 to 5-year-olds is challenging and nearly impossible for some children that are preschool age and have ADHD. Yet identifying these brain changes associated with risk before a diagnosis of ADHD is critical for early preventative interventions. So one potential solution is the use of fNIRS. So functional near infrared spectroscopy is an alternative neuroimaging technique that uses light and is not sensitive to motion like MRI, which could help us examine brain activity in these very young children. fNIRS is a wearable imaging technique with a head cap. It uses light to measure oxygenation and deoxygenated hemoglobin and looks at changes in oxygen in the cerebral blood as an indirect measure of activity in the neurons. So it works the very same way. Essentially, it's telling us the same information as MRI, but it uses a different technology to do that. And in fact, many studies that are examining or comparing findings between MRI and fNIRS are finding similar results. So they are kind of capturing the same change in oxygen or neural activity signal. So near infrared light, which is used in this modality, can travel through the skin and bone and reach the brain. This is the same light that's actually used in pulse oximetry meters that measures oxygen in the blood. And hemoglobin, which carries oxygen, is absorbed, it absorbs near infrared light at different wavelengths depending on if it's carrying oxygen or not. And that's what allows us to detect if oxygen is being used in the brain in different regions. fNIRS is safe and non-invasive. The near infrared light that is emitted through a source and detected by a detector that absorbs the light. And despite its advantages over fMRI, so I've already mentioned that it's less sensitive to motion, it is silent, and although these machines are expensive, they're very cheap compared to an MRI machine. And the other difference is when you're after you purchase a fNIRS machine, there are no additional costs for operating it, unlike an MRI, which requires staff, and it's done in a hospital setting. Like this is a much cheaper operating cost. But it does have some limitations that are worth noting. First, it does not allow for visualization of brain structures like an MRI does. And the second is that it's limited to assessment of activity or brain activity on the cortex, which is just the outer surface of the brain. And that's just due to how far the light can penetrate. So the light needs to pass through the scalp, the skull, the cerebral spinal fluid before reaching the brain. So it really only detects activity on the surface of the brain. So with the Brain Behavior Research Foundation Young Investigator Award, I was provided the opportunity to examine brain activity, specifically in the prefrontal cortex and the dorsal attention network, so the frontal eye fields and the parietal lobes, among 50 preschool-age children. And we looked at familial risk. So these are where half the children were born to parents with ADHD, and half of the children were born to parents without ADHD. So for this project, the children came into the lab at age 4 and then again at age 5. And fNIRS data collection was obtained while the children were watching a 7-minute computer-generated animation, which is designed to keep children engaged during brain imaging. We had 2 goals of the project. The first was to compare brain activity of children born to parents with versus without ADHD. And the second was to examine brain activity at age 4 as a predictor of ADHD symptoms at age 5. Okay, so what did we find? Well, first to orient you to the results here. So if you're looking at this image, it obviously looks very different than an MRI image. You don't see the brain structures. You just see sort of these marks where we've put where the source and detectors are located on the head cap. And then we have lines that are connecting between the sources and detectors that are showing you which regions are active in relation to one another. And then there's some directionality. So if the colors are more warm, so they're this like green, yellow, blue, or sorry, green, yellow, orange, or red. And so in this picture, they're all orange that are greater activity. So these are greater associations between activity in these regions. And then you see one line that is blue, so that is less connectivity or activity between those two regions. Okay, so what we see here is that children at high familial risk for ADHD had greater connectivity between the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the inferior parietal lobe, and then also within the dorsal attention network. So you see the two other yellow lines, those are the parietal lobes and the frontal eye fields. That all is part of the dorsal attention network. So we interpret this to mean that perhaps children that are at risk for ADHD, they have parents with ADHD, require greater connection, prefrontal cortex connection to the attention network to maintain engagement as compared to children who do not have a parent with ADHD. Interestingly, we also found that children with high familial risk for ADHD had lower connection between the left frontal eye field and the right prefrontal cortex. And perhaps this is associated with less top-down control over the frontal eye fields that might suggest more distractibility. We're going to look at measures of distractibility and kind of compare this finding with those reports of distractibility or even some distractibility coded during the assessment to try to explore this a little bit further. So for the second project aim, we examined neural connectivity at age 4 as a predictor of ADHD symptoms at age 5. And we found that greater connectivity between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the dorsal attention network, as well as less connectivity between the prefrontal eye fields or prefrontal cortex and the frontal eye fields, were associated with greater ADHD symptoms a year later, controlling for their symptoms at age 4. So to kind of simplify that a bit, is that these findings here sort of model what we saw previously, in that children at high risk for ADHD are maybe needing a little more help from the prefrontal cortex to maintain attention. And if we're seeing that at age 4, it's already predictive of greater or increasing ADHD symptoms by age 5. So the BBRF Young Investigator Award project really served as a proof of concept for a larger NIH-sponsored study that is now ongoing. In this study, we will enroll 210 3- and 4-year-olds and their parent, and then follow the children to 5 and 6 years of age to examine brain activity as predictors of ADHD symptom trajectories from preschool to school entry. We also aim to identify specific parenting behaviors that strengthen neural activity and enhance child attention control that could ultimately inform interventions to reduce the development of ADHD symptoms. But if ADHD symptoms, problematic behavior regulation, and differences in brain activity are all present as early as 3 years of age for children at risk for ADHD, so they have parents with ADHD, can we identify even earlier signals of ADHD, maybe beginning in infancy, that might predict which children could go on to develop ADHD? Okay, so in a separate study that is led by Judith Morgan, I was able to examine 51 children ages 1.5 to 3 years old using fNIRS while they were engaging with a book, in relation to how their mothers reported ADHD related behavior. So like attention problems, for example. So here what we found is that similar to our preschool findings, children that had greater ADHD-related behavior problems as reported by their mother also had greater frontal parietal connectivity, in particular between the prefrontal cortex and the temporal parietal junction on the right. So this image is facing the other direction, unfortunately. So the down at the bottom, you can see the little triangle that's indicating like where the nose is. So this is actually on the same side of the brain as the findings we saw in preschool. So that's exciting that we're seeing this across developmental periods. But we also know that attention develops rapidly in the first 2 years of life and can be measured objectively with eye tracking and cognitive tasks in infancy. So specifically looking tasks and the leveraging like infants' novelty preference, which is essentially stating that infants prefer to look at new or unfamiliar things. And this has been used in the field of infant cognitive development to understand typical developing attention and learning across infancy and early childhood. So for an NIH-sponsored K Award, I was able to examine if these attention tasks could be leveraged to examine early differences in attention among infants at familial risk for ADHD. So to test this theory, we enrolled 2 cohorts of infants into the Pittsburgh ADHD Risk in Infancy studies, and they were administered computer tasks measuring habituation at 9 months of age. So you can see here we had a total of 151 mother, father, infant triads. Interestingly, this sample, half of this sample, are actually the kids that we brought in for the preschool study that was sponsored by Brain Behavior Research Foundation, which I just presented. So these infants have been followed to preschool age, and we're still continuing to follow some of them to school age in the Athens study. So when they were enrolled in the study, moms and dads and the babies all enrolled as participants, and both mom and dad received a clinical assessment by either a psychiatrist or psychologist to determine their ADHD status. So in the end, we had 71 high risk for ADHD infants, so they had at least one parent with ADHD, and 80 low risk for ADHD infants, so neither parent had ADHD. So infant looking time, so let's see, so infants look longer at novel, unfamiliar stimuli, as I mentioned, and this is how they learn about the world. So they look at new things, they examine new things, and they start to make connections and understandings of how the world works. And individual differences in looking time have been found to predict future cognitive performance. So with shorter looking times, reflecting greater processing speed or attention. Thus, I wondered if these validated tasks could be leveraged to identify infants at greatest risk for developing ADHD. So what is habituation? So I said we used a habituation task, a computerized task. So habituation is a diminished or reducing response. So in this case, the response is infant looking time to a frequently repeated stimuli or image. So basically faster habituation. Infants who stop looking or understand, learn the stimuli, don't find it novel or familiar any longer, quicker is associated with greater attention. So we hypothesized that children at risk for ADHD would have longer looking times and be slower to habituate, representing lower levels of attention. So the task included 20 trials with a maximum of 20 seconds per trial. Each trial ends when the infant looks away from the screen for more than 2 seconds. So habituation is reached when the looking time drops to half or less than half of the average looking time for the first 3 trials. So the trial stimuli in this case, so what they were looking at is both an auditory and visual stimuli. And Winnie the Pooh is an attention grabber between trials. So I'll demonstrate it here in a video. You likely will not hear the sound, but I will describe what's happening for you. Okay. So this is the attention grabber to get the infant to look at the screen. There's someone in the background saying, look, it's Winnie the Pooh. Then this is the stimuli. So they see this circle that is looming back and forth, and there's a sound. It says ga, ga, ga. When the infant looks away from this circle, they find it no longer to be interesting. They look away, then the attention grabber returns. So it says, look, it's Winnie the Pooh, to try to get the infant to look at the screen again. Then this image is shown. So that's repeated until the infant stops looking for a period of time that is less than half of what they initially looked at. So we examined the average duration of looking in seconds across the y-axis, and for each trial of the 20 trials on the x-axis, and we were able to identify 3 subgroups. The first group was short lookers. So that's the red trajectory here. And they had a mean initial looking time of 8 seconds. So on average, the infants looked at the first stimuli of the looming circle for about 8 seconds before they looked away from the screen. And on average, they needed to see the stimuli 10 times before they looked less than half. So if 8 was their average, they needed to look at less than 4 seconds each time it was presented to habituate. So by study design, these infants are believed to have the greatest attention and the most efficient processing speed. So they see the stimuli, they don't need to look very long at it, they recognize that it's familiar, and they look away, and by 10 presentations, they're no longer interested because it's a known image. So we also found 2 long looker groups. In these long looker groups, they had a mean initial looking time of 20 seconds and 18 seconds of looking. And the 2 long looker groups differed by the mean number of trials to habituation. So the first one, they're long lookers who were fast to habituate. So if you remember, the short lookers habituated by 10 trials. These individuals looked for a long time initially, so 18 seconds, but then they did not need to continue to see the stimuli for more than 7 presentations to habituate. Whereas the second, or the third group actually here, but the second long looker group were a slow to habituate. So it took them 12 trials to habituate. So next we wanted to examine the odds of an infant being high risk for ADHD if they were in one of the 2 long looker versus short looker groups. So the odds of being a long looker, fast to habituate, versus short looker is 2.5 times, and it didn't quite reach statistical significance in our sample, but there's a trend that if you are a long looker, fast to habituate, you are more likely, almost 2.5 times more likely, to have a parent with ADHD than if you were in the short looker group. And when we looked at the long looker, slow to habituate group versus the short lookers, so this blue group is believed to have the least optimal attention compared to the short looker group, which is believed to have the most optimal attention. There is a statistically significant difference here, and the individuals in the blue group versus the red group are 4.5 times more likely to have a parent with ADHD. And these odds remained even after adjusting for infant sex and parent education. So we think that these are exciting preliminary findings that suggest that habituation might be an early marker of risk for childhood ADHD. But our next steps are to follow these infants longitudinally. So I mentioned that's ongoing, and we'll be able to examine these objective markers of infant attention as predictors of behavior in toddlerhood, as well as ADHD symptoms and diagnosis at preschool age. And finally, our team also had the opportunity to collect fNIRS data in the newborn pair samples, so the second cohort. We were able to bring in about 50 of those children to complete fNIRS assessments at 9 months and 12 months of age. And we're excited to examine these data and to see if the same brain connectivity patterns that we're seeing in our preschool age sample are present as early as the first year of life And we also plan to examine brain changes across the first year of life, as well as comparing children's performance on the attention tasks or the habituation task that we just shared. So if they were long looker versus short looker, do they have different brain connectivities as early as 9 and 12 months of age? I hope to come back and share these exciting results in the future. And it's really been a pleasure to share this research today. I also want to mention that this, like all science, is done in large teams. So it's very important for me to be able to acknowledge the many people who have made this work possible, including mentors, collaborators, research staff, and of course the funders that supported these projects. So I'm sure we have time to talk through some questions.
Great. Well, Heather, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about what types of early interventions might be done when somebody is spotted to be at risk.
Yes, that's a great question. So I think there are already things that are in place that we know are effective and helpful, right? So there are things like parent-child interaction training for very young kids that can help improve disruptive behaviors, that can help improve child social skills. It can help improve parent-child interactions and parenting abilities that can promote the development of self-regulation, attention, impulse control. So we can use some of the skills and therapies that are already present to try to do early intervention if we identify these individuals early. But also I'm really interested in trying to find new avenues and different avenues that we could use. So for the current study that we're running, the Athens study, we're collecting parent and infant brain activity at the same time. And we're trying to see if there are things that the parent does that might influence the child's brain activity. So are there specific behaviors or neural activities that can promote the attention network and the development of these strong connections that might be needed to enhance attention and impulse control for these young kids?
That's great. And obviously in the developing brain, that's a good time for interventions as these connections are being made as the brain is developing.
Right. This is a time where your brain is modifiable and is definitely being influenced by environment, parenting, learning experiences.
Are there steps that parents should take if they are concerned that perhaps their child is showing some of these symptoms? What should a parent do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So really, honestly, pediatricians are sort of our first line for identifying changes in child development or behavioral concerns. I think speaking with your pediatrician would be a really good first step. There's a lot of movement towards having integrated teams where pediatric offices also have behavioral specialists. They could refer you for more formal diagnostic assessments, things like neuropsych testing that could help guide treatments or planning for school entry. And then certainly if even, you know, this is never to say that parenting causes ADHD. I don't believe that, but we certainly can improve how we help our child if we learn different ways to support them. So seeking out parent management training or parent behavioral interventions can also be very helpful for the parent and the child. It's also true that children who have difficulty with emotion regulation and behavior control are harder to parent. It can certainly be more stressful. And if you as a parent are stressed and overwhelmed, it's harder to be the warm parent in responding to these disruptive behaviors that you might want to be.
These are all very good points. We don't get trained how to be parents.
No.
Or very minimally get trained how to be parents. It's hard enough if the child doesn't have any challenges whatsoever, much less if the child does have some of these challenges.
Right. And we know that ADHD runs in families. So now imagine that you're a parent with ADHD. It's hard to have emotion regulation and planning and respond consistently. Like, these are the deficits of ADHD. So it makes it really hard to be a parent with ADHD and support a child with ADHD.
You spoke about the study looking at fathers and the children with ADHD. How about the role of mothers? What are the findings there?
Great question. So actually, there's much more work and research that has been done with mothers with ADHD or mothers of children with ADHD, whether they themselves have ADHD or not. So what we do know is that parents of children with ADHD experience more stress. They have higher rates of depression and anxiety. And of course, all parents of children with ADHD are more likely to they themselves have ADHD, whether they were diagnosed or treated. So there is a greater risk of mental health disorders among parents of children with ADHD. When that's the case, we definitely see that there's more challenges in parenting, and that treatment, parents' treatment, so mothers is what we've mostly looked at, is if mothers receive treatment for depression or ADHD, they see improvements in their ability to implement behavioral interventions for their children and have better outcomes for their kids as well.
So for the mothers, by they themselves getting treatment, it not only helps their symptoms, it helps the symptoms and potentially the course of the condition for the child.
That's right.
As you look forward in terms of your research, what if we were doing this in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, what would you hope to be able to say at that point in time?
Mm-hmm. In 5 to 10 years, I hope that we are able to consistently show some of these differences that could be used to identify which children are at greatest risk and to do more preventative interventions. So not waiting until the child already is having impairment at school or disrupted peer relationships, but can we sort of see early on that this kid needs a little more support and try to have an easier transition to school, and also, you know, that will result in better outcomes for the whole family, for the parents, for the siblings.
I think that's so important. You know, we as a field up until recently haven't looked at the issue of prevention. We sort of respond once the diagnosis happens, and we're moving more and more to looking at methods of prevention before the illness may fully show itself. Finally, I want to ask you words of wisdom to parents. What do you say to parents when they come into your office with a child who's showing some of these symptoms? What guidance do you give them?
Yeah, so I think it's really important for parents to have grace with themselves. None of us are perfect. We're not going to get it right the first time, the second time, or we may be inconsistent as to when we get it right. But that's okay. Children are very resilient, and we're learning. And I think getting support from your team, whoever that is that your partner, your parents, your neighbors, the school systems, the pediatrician, finding a way to get help for yourself, get help for your child, take a break when you need to take a break, and consistently tell your child that they are good. Right? So unfortunately, ADHD presents as, behaviors that are considered bad behaviors. And if we spend a lot of time focusing on bad behaviors, does the child start to internalize, like, I'm bad? So we can really have more of a strength-based, resilience-based focus with children and parents, and children will learn to have more attention, to take breaks if they need to ask for help, to learn regulation skills, and to be more resilient.
Such good guidance, Heather. I just so appreciate the work you're doing, your approach to this. If I were a parent with a young child who's having these issues, I certainly want to come to you for evaluation and guidance. So thank you so much for all that you're doing and will continue to do.
I lost the audio. Are you talking?
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, good. So with that, I'm again saying thank you, Heather, for providing us with an extraordinary presentation. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. I want to ask people to consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate a dollar for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a gift, visit bbrfoundation.org or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. We'll be back next January and throughout the year with an exciting schedule of Meet the Scientist webinars. I wish you and your families a warm and healthy holiday season and a very happy new year. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.